This is Theology Bits with Pastor Ben, a ministry of Central Lutheran Church, Eugene, Oregon. This week we continue our series, Continuity and Change in the Old Testament, video 11, focusing on the rise of the temple. Now, if you recall from the last video, or if you look up the playlist, you'll see it, we left with David establishing a new structure, that is, a nation. And the role of the king is expanded to be both governing matters religious and matters political. Then David has a covenant with God in which he and his house will have the throne forever. Other elements as well, but we'll go with that for now. And if you recall, David has a request. I'd like to build for God a house, a permanent dwelling. And he does this in Jerusalem, his new capital that he's put together. And in this capital, the first thing he does is moves the Ark of the Covenant in. And it's a very important aspect because the Ark of the Covenant is something that was always movable. It had been in the tabernacle or tent. And the tabernacle was structured from the wilderness as something that moved around wherever the people were. The mobility of it was an asset because the people are mobile. Of course they are. People move all over the place. Well, now we're going to have something new. We're going to think differently about what this new capital is and what it says about what happened. So the next generation, new king, Solomon. Now, of course, for Solomon to become king, there's a lot of temple intrigue. It's a very bloody affair, as is the entirety of this Deuteronomistic history in David's court. It always was a bloody affair. But Solomon, there's a lot of things to say about Solomon, but what I want to focus on is the big development of change in religiosity is his building of the temple. So when David said to God, I want to build you a house, God said, no, you can't do that yet. You have to be a house, meaning a dynasty with descendants. Well, guess what? He has a descendant now. He has this idea that the throne will last is being acted out. It has lasted. And while you say, well, it only is one person, remember that didn't work for Saul. His descendants did not become the new kings that David did. So this has already happened. So he's going to build the temple. And the point to the temple is that it's permanent. It will no longer be movable at all. And you notice I moved immediately here over to the ark because the key to the temple is going to be the Ark of the Covenant, within which it specifically mentions what's there. The tablets Moses received, upon which is the Ten Commandments. The staff of Aaron, the jar with the manna in it. What is it within the ark? Well, the ark is the Sinai covenant. And so we're bringing that which was movable from the wilderness permanently into one place. A brick and mortar structure upon not just any structure, but it's on the top of a mountain. Turns out Jerusalem, where David had his capital, is a relatively good place to put a capital if you're interested in military defense, in the sense that it's at the top of a mountain. And the whole mountain will become very important. It'll be called Zion. And there's going to be a new theology here coming up out of this mountain, this physical place. Remember the Sinai covenant? No one knew where Sinai was. It's not even preserved in the book of Exodus. And it was deliberately not there because where is Sinai? Where is the Ten Commandments? Where is that covenant? Well, frankly, it's wherever the people are. Now this is different. Because now, where is Zion? Well, you could find exactly where Zion is. It's the mountain upon which Jerusalem stands, the same as remains today. So now we have a very physical, concrete place where the Ark of the Covenant is going to be, where it is going to be now called the mountain of God. Very different than what we've had. This place has become a place of God's presence here in the temple, not the whole mountain, though sometimes it's viewed as the whole mountain, but usually in the temple, this is where God dwells on earth. Others would not be so bold, even in the Old Testament, and they'll say it's not where God dwells, but it's how God communicates. From here, you pray to God, God responds through this place outwardly to the rest of the world. Later tradition would be Zion is actually the center of the world and the tallest mountain of all because it's the mountain of God. So this is a completely new idea. And then Solomon goes about building this temple. And he hires Hiram of Tyre to build this. And they build a temple that actually, architecturally, looks a lot like other temples in the ancient Near East. And I'm not going to do a great job drawing this because that's not my strength. But it's a 3-tiered building where you have a portico or exterior entrance. You have a nave where you have most of the people present. And then you have a small, it's actually smaller than this by scale, but this is how I drew it, separate section called the Holy of Holies. And in this space is where the Ark of the Covenant is going to go. And so external to the temple, there is a very large altar and a very large basin of water. And there's a lot going on with all of this, and there's more things happening. This is very, very basic. There's a lot of different altars and so forth. But this is the structure. And the Ark of God is every step of the way in the temple becomes more exclusive. Who can be there? And to all the way who are the Holy of Holies, almost nobody can be there because that's where God is. Or maybe that's how God communicates. But this is this very idea. Maybe that's where God's name dwells. Well, this is the temple that Solomon builds. Again, looks like temples in the ancient Near East. There's a few archaeological remains of temples that look a lot like this. One that's almost exactly the same, except that it divides this section in the middle. Then we'd say, okay, well, I get that. That's what you were supposed to do. Solomon's supposed to build a temple. Now this is permanently on your capital. But Solomon makes the point even stronger. He also, and this was not required, but he chooses to build a palace, a new palace for his. And guess what he does architecturally with it? Well, it has a portico. It has a main hall. And then it has a very exclusive separate section where his throne is. Well, I hope you can see the obvious parallels here. What is Solomon doing? Remember here, the religious and the political have become one through the king. Well, Solomon's gone even farther. He's made kind of a triangle where there is the king. And remember, the king has this covenant that this throne is never going to get lost. And then he builds this temple and he puts it in his capital. Well, what's happened? The king has tied himself to the temple so that this temple, this permanent thing, is also tied to this permanent thing. And that's tied to this permanent thing. What's just happened here? This Ark of the Covenant that is housed now in this temple was supposed to be movable, to go wherever the people go. Now, it's not movable at all. In fact, even if you were to lose the ark, eventually they will lose the ark, that the king and the temple are one thing, and the temple is in a real place, well, that real place remains. As long as there is a Mount Zion, there is a capital. And this really changes how we think about things. Because remember this whole idea of the king, David's line, will last, will endure? Well, and so thereby, does that mean the temple will last? Well, you can sort of get that idea. It's a place of God. But does that mean that the national capital will last forever? This idea starts to come in. That is called the inviolability of Zion. That Zion could never be conquered because this is where God really was. And so then you have this idea that the capital won't fall. Well, in this covenant with the king, never said that. But what's happened, they've tied the king to the capital. And they also looked at it and said, well, what makes this nation? Remember, David established this as a nation that changed what it was to be religious. Well, now the nation looks different. Because remember, if you remember all the way back, I think about 3 videos ago, to when Samuel hears they want a king, and he says, why do you want a king? The people were a disparate 12 tribes who wanted to gather together as one people in order to express themselves politically and religiously. And what happens, maybe they weren't planning on it, is they become this nation. Well, in David's time, the nation was constituted of the citizens. Well, of course it was. Isn't that what a nation is? Well, now it's something else. What's the king of? What's the nation? The nation is more about the capital than it is about the people. Meaning, if you were to lose, say, 4/5 of your area that you feel you govern, and 4/5, or actually 5/6 of the people rebel and leave you, but you're left with the capital, you would say my nation's still intact. That, by the way, is not a hypothetical. It's what will happen in the very next generation, when 10 out of the 12 tribes rebel and form a separate nation, but the 2 remaining have the capital and the kingship from David, and so they say thereby it hasn't changed. So what's happened? How are we thinking about who God is? Well, God has become a very national God, more than we've ever seen, because we always assume, well, of course, God is there for the people. Well, here it's changed. God is there for the nation, held in the capital. Now, that's not always bad. That can be, out of Zion flows Sinai. Out of this capital is where God's real covenant works with the people. But you see how easily this is going to get corrupted. And we're going to see that as this goes on. Remember, this whole story is, how did this happen? How did this thing that was never supposed to fall? How is it that when you were put into this land because God has given it to you, gets taken away? Well, we're going to be continuing to think about that, but look at how differently they are being religious in this time period as compared to before. This has been Theology Bits. I'm Pastor Ben.